Rachel, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Which hat do you want me wearing?
Fedora.
Ooh, okay. So my public persona hat is I'm a blogger. I have a blog called Fencing Bear at Prayer, if you want my sort of spiritual journey in that sense. I have a group of poets that I've been working with for several years. We formed on Telegram in the Dragon Common Room, and we're writing Christian allegory, mythology for audiences of all ages, right? We've done children's books. We are doing adults stories. We're working on a fantasy horror now called Draco Alchemicus. And with one of my poets, I do a live stream now called The Mosaic Arc, which is a mystical exploration of the electric mosaic. So that's my fedora hat.
What electric mosaic? What does that mean?
So we're in it, right? Although I think technically this is part of the digital mosaic, that we are in this media. And I love that I was asking you just before we started, where are we streaming, right? It's like we're into this media environment, which has some very interesting spiritual and mainly spiritual characteristics. If you're familiar with the work of Marshall McLuhan on media, have you ever encountered thinking about the problem? We're in the global village, we're in this digital environment that the medium is the message kind of thing. I mean, everything that we're doing in the media world that we live in has an effect, regardless of the content of the conversation. And McLuhan was a great scholar and theorist of this media effect. So in our Mosaic Arc, we're trying to, as a live stream, carry into this media some of the mystery, the mystical questions that we've experienced in other media, the alphabet, manuscript, printing, the electric media of things like radio and television, and now into this digital streaming media. So we call it the Mosaic Arc because we're putting together pieces, all of these stories and patterns and things that we're finding out there in the internet. And the arc it's an image from the scriptures saying both the ark that carries the Noah's family on the flood, but also the ark that carries the presence of the Lord in the temple, and the ark that is, in Christian terms, Our Lady, who bears Christ into the world in physical form, right? So if that explains it, I'm happy. If it doesn't, I'm not surprised, because it's been tricky figuring out. It's like, how do you explain this experience that we're in with the streaming media? That's my fedora hat.
Gotcha. Also, I like your sword. That's from Lord of the Rings, the Frodo's sword, right?
That is indeed that Sting. I mean, another of my fedora hats is I do videos on unauthorized TV, and I have a series there on the Forge of Tolkien, right? So on the sort of project that Tolkien was engaged in his storytelling.
Awesome. All right. So the topic today was, does history show that Christianity is true or scripture is reliable? Could you tell me your position on that in general? I'm an atheist, of course, so I think that in general, Jesus existed as a human, but I don't think any of the miracle stuff happened. And I think a lot of the history described in the Bible is probably not true. Like, I don't think Moses existed or Abraham, Isaac. I think those are all apocryphal stories, not real. What is your position?
Well, my position is that we need to think about what we define as historically true and factual. And if some of your audience feels like then I just ran away, I appreciate that. But this is one of the problems that I have. You want me to put my scholarly hat on? Clearly, my my PhD hat. But the thing is, that's also my Christian hat, in the sense of one of the major claims, which you are right to set as the question. It's like, is the incarnation historically real? And we'll say, well, that is how we actually frame our questions, how we think about our questions. We claim within Christianity, therefore within the Western tradition that's been created by this conversation, that we exist in a meaningful arc of time. Now, if you want to say no, time is meaningless and there is no sort of structure to our understanding, then that's a different kind of conversation. If you want to have an argument about, or discussion about, the significance of before and after and cause and effect, then we can can do that one, but I need to. That's why I actually need to know which hat you want me to wear, because, and this is also it's a proper when Augustine is advising his friend Deo Gratias back in AD 400, how do you talk to people when they come to you for catechism, when you come to for instruction? The first thing you have to know is where they're coming from, so that you know what frame of reference you're talking in. So I need to know more about what your frame of reference is before I can answer the questions that you're posing to me.
Sure. So I think that I'm a moral realist, so I believe in objective morality, meaning, purpose, that kind of stuff. And I probably would say that the most significant time is always going to be the time that is the most technologically advanced, because that's when the most morally significant actions are probably taking place. So I probably say that we're in the most significant time in human history right now, until some kind of massive apocalypse happens, the zombie apocalypse or something. But um, definitely think that right now we're in the most significant form of humanity and have the most impact on moral decision making and what uh, shapes what conscious experience is going to be for most beings in the universe.
Oh, I mean, that's when I'm talking about the stream right now and saying we're speaking into this electron this I mean, it's electric digital stream. Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is the moment in our incarnation that we need to be able to understand this. Now, but you add that takes us in a different direction from saying, do I think that, we need to talk about Jesus as historically real? Or the thing is, I warned you. I warned your producer when I came on. It's like I will seem like I'm sort of pulling back and back and back from the question, but the questions you asked me, do I think Abraham and Moses were real? In order to understand my answer to that, you have to understand what I think about sort of historical proof, right? And the kinds of arguments that we can make as historians, and the kinds of questions that have arisen within scholarship to make that a question that you would ask me, right? Is this true? Is this making any sense yet?
Oh yeah, sure. So I
I'm
would
just being cautious because I don't want to launch into what I would say is my answer before I understand where your frame is starting from.
Sure. So from my
Okay.
studies of history, I've read one of my favorite papers from a Christian, Mike Licona, his on historians and miracle claims. He
Okay.
references a bunch of quotes from different historians on their take on um, metaphysics and ontology and how history can relate to those things. And the consensus seems to be something like, in history, the method of history is not allowed to make claims on things that don't have an empirical basis. So miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal,
Oh,
supernatural,
okay.
UFOs.
Okay. But you believe in those or you don't believe in those?
I do not believe in those.
But when you were talking about the sort of experience that we're in media terms, and the sort of technological and such, you said, and other beings. So are there other beings than us, than human beings or animals?
Well, beings, I just meant consciousnesses. So I don't think there's anything. I'm a materialist, so I don't think there is beyond our planet. Essentially, maybe aliens out there that we don't know of, but I think it's just physical stuff. Us animals, and
Okay, it's materialist, but we do have something called consciousness,
yes,
which is an emergent property of our material experience.
yep, that is my
Okay.
position.
Okay. All right, go carry on with the historians.
Yeah, so I think that historical testimony of the past is better explained by the psychological conditions we know about today. So delusion, hallucination, misconceptions, the tens of
Okay.
thousands of fallacies, biases, those kinds of things. And those seem to be better explanations of any miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFO claims. And so it would be unreliable to treat historical documents as accurate representations of those kinds of events, because we know that the human mind is not a reliable source of information when it comes to presenting new ontologies or new existing things that we don't have a basis for. And so, if for historical claims like I saw a dog, perfectly reasonable, or Caesar crossed the Rubicon, perfectly reasonable, Jesus existed, sure, miracles happened, not so much.
Okay, this is helping me a lot. I'm glad I asked. So, this is so many philosophical claims to unpack. I okay, so let's play a game. I would think that we have better historical evidence for Jesus's resurrection than for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon.
How so?
So I did a post back in the Trump days, called Fake News. And I said, my blog is Fencing Barrett Prayer. You can find some of these there. And I gave a little test because everybody was very upset about, how can we tell what's true in, and then you're bracketing. It's like, what kind of truth are we looking for? Are we truth in Trump's motivation? Are we looking, truth in, I mean, most of the time human beings are worried about what other people think, right? So we're in this mode of, can I trust so-and-so's actions, right? So the fake news is like, is it about whether events happened, or is it about motivations, or is it about, I mean, as you're pointing to things like, things that some people claim to have witnessed, but not everybody can see. That sort of, where are we going to go with what is fake? And the example I gave was, I pulled out 5 different stories, and I said, if you were reading these in a historical document, which of them would you believe was reliable, right? From the historians reporting. And one of them was, now there's several in the same sources that I was looking at, but just like, these dogs, these miraculous little dogs found in a rock, or these children that show up out of a ditch and are green. Or a fairy world where a man goes underground and comes back with a goblet that he finds. Okay, so maybe you might have a story like that, and then in another context you might have a story about political events that are happening in Italy between the emperor and the city republic governments in Milan, or something like that. There's a battle in Italy, but the source you have is written in England. Okay, so that's another one. There is a massacre, or something happens in the castle in York when a number of Jews they've taken refuge there from people who want to get after them for their money lending. Because the king is calling for a big new tax to go on crusade, and the Jews are in the castle, and they all kill themselves by way of an argument that one of their rabbis makes. Now, of those stories, which one would you say we as historians should accept as actually true? So there's these miraculous, these sort of apparently dog event, or the political story related from a distance, or this event in which everyone in the room kills himself.
Well, I would start with assessing it from an a priori standpoint. So we'd start with what evidence do we have of things that exist, and if you add in something that we don't have that exists, that would be the first elimination. So whatever stories add in something that doesn't, we have no evidence it exists, would be eliminated. So the fairies one, if we're going to believe that at face value, do fairies actually exist based on this story, we'd be like, nope, that one's out. Now we can
Okay.
take it as a psychological manipulation of some kind, or an interpretation, and say, "Oh no, he was just having one of those illusions," because there's actually a condition where you literally will see leprechauns, and that has a name. I don't remember what it's called though. And if you want to say he had this condition, so he actually experienced these things, that we can believe, but we can't. We would not be able to accept fairies actually exist based off this testimony. The second story about the political thing, even it's from a source that comes from thousands of miles away, so it would be less credible than a story of an eyewitness, but it's still more credible than the fairies. So because all the claims in the story are physically possible, have an empirical basis, it's going to be better than the fairies. But because it has a weak source from thousands of miles away, it's less plausible. And the third one, you didn't give me the source, and you said they committed suicide via arguments. I don't. Did you literally mean like he presented an argument and they all just died from the argument, kind of a thing?
No, he persuades them to kill themselves.
Okay, gotcha. I was like, it would be much more impressive if he just the death argument that just everyone hears and they just fall over
No,
dead.
that he makes an argument about why, given the situation that they're in, that they need to commit murder, they commit mass suicide.
So in that case, that one would probably be the most believable of the story because it doesn't have as weak evidence. But if you know the history of the background, I'd still doubt it because I don't know if a lot of Jews exist in that time period. But so I'd probably place that as from the order you presented them, would be from least to most.
Okay. Now, our question as historians is, if we're going to evaluate these stories, we would have to look at who's reporting them. right? Which you were starting to do, saying just like this account would be less reliable because it's in, making these sorts of a priori claims, and this account maybe it's reportage from a distance. Could we believe that? The third one, well, literally everyone in the room was dead when the door opened, right? So how would we know what happened in that room, right? It could have been a completely different scenario from the one that the narrator gives us.
Yeah,
What
you
would
didn't tell me
you
the source on the third one, so I was just like going off. We heard the
well,
story.
realizing I didn't tell you the source in any of them.
Well, the first one you said you did. The second one you gave us a source was from York or something. You said you said
Right, and well, the third story is set in York, and I said the second one was reported by someone writing in England
yeah,
around York.
yeah,
You should be aware that there's a trick in this. It's the same source.
yeah.
All of those stories are in exactly the same chronicle, so they're all written by the same person.
For me, that wouldn't make a difference here. I'd say that the first stage
But
is
this is the problem the historians are faced with, right? And in my blog post, I say, look, we would, when we're out there on the internet, we're saying, well, this story is more likely. I mean, it was the fake news problems, like which are the reliable sources.
mhm,
And my point in this exercise was say, interestingly, all of those stories I collected, there were 5, and I always can't remember what the other 2 examples I gave were, but we are more likely to believe these political reports because probably these political events happen. We do have other sources that talk about them, so maybe they're corroborated. But interestingly, the ones that are about, the dogs in the rock or the what happened in York and the castle are local stories. Like the stories that our narrator is William Newborough. He's a historian, a chronicler who writes in the late 12th century in Northumbria. And he says, I got these local stories by, reliable report from people who saw them. We read these stories about what's going on with the imperial forces in northern Italy, and we say, well, that sounds like political history, so it's more reliable. The problem with what happens with the Jews at York is indeed they all died. So how do you know what kind of conversation they had in that room before they're all found dead later? Which is you realize from our present political situation, often a very complicated thing, because do we as Christians, have a responsibility for that mass murder? Because there were, Christians who were besieging the castle, and then the people inside assumed that something was going to happen to them. They were going to be baptized potentially, and so they decided to kill themselves. Why, right? And it's actually a moderately compassionate argument that William gives the rabbi in this situation. As historians, we are. Okay, and I should tell you one other piece of information about William, that he is recognized in the 19th century as the father of modern historical criticism, because famously in his chronicle, he at the outset says Geoffrey of Monmouth made up everything about King Arthur. Because if you look at what Geoffrey of Monmouth says about King Arthur, it can't fit with what we know from these other sources. And here's Bede with his chronology and Erosius with his chronology. And King Arthur is certainly made up because we don't have him in these other sources. But now I'm going to tell you stories about how, green children came up out of this ditch. So the irony from historical sort of methodology is the very same person who is recognized as critical of his sources in his own time tells stories that we now would consider fabulous, right? So the first criterion of our historical source criticism is itself entangled in these claims about reliability of narration.
Well, I would consider that secondary. So, from my perspective, the particular source and whether they're reliable would come second to the claim itself. So, like if I said I saw a dog, that would be reasonable. If I said I saw a unicorn, that would be unreasonable. And it doesn't matter who the source is. Any human being says these 2 statements, the dog's going to be reasonable, the unicorn is always going to be less reasonable, independent of the source. And so I think that the kind of claim is the first metric we use to assess the reasonability of a particular claim of historical or any kind of testimony. And then after that comes who the source is, are they reliable witnesses, are they rational, and we start to assess what if the person is trustworthy. But that seems to be second to the claim itself. What is the claim itself rational?
Um, Why do you believe in reason?
What do you mean? Like
Well,
literally logic?
so literally logic, but rationality. I mean, you're Humean in most of your arguments here. That you're following David Hume's premise that miracles can't happen, and
No.
therefore,
Mm,
no. Okay, so miracles can happen.
yes.
Okay, so that's it. Okay, so that no, we continue finding the ground of what you're saying are a priori assumptions, but I mean, the assumption of rationality is an interesting one to start with because it's our squishy things that are in our heads creating that illusion of our ability to think in logical structures.
Yeah. So two things there. Rationality. I believe rationality, logic, and math are languages we use to describe our experience. So I don't think they're transcendental in any sense. But in regards to Hume, I absolutely think miracles are possible. Like there's no logical
Okay,
contradiction. I'm a straight philosopher. If it's got no logical contradiction, it's possible.
okay.
But I'd say that if there's no evidence for them happening, and we do have evidence for some other thing happening, um, that could explain the data, the other thing is always going to be the default explanation of whatever phenomenon we're talking about. And so, because there's no evidence of unicorns, if someone said they saw a unicorn, it's always going to be more likely that they had a delusion because we have lots of evidence of delusions, no evidence of unicorns. And so, if there's some phenomenon of a person saw a unicorn, the better explanation is going to be delusion in every case because of the evidence we have, not because it's impossible. I think it's perfectly possible to see a unicorn. I just don't think, based on the evidence we have, them actually seeing a unicorn is the best explanation of the data set.
So we don't. Oh, so is it we don't trust? Okay, so there's a number of layers there, right? One is they could have seen something that has one horn and simply you don't understand their description, which is typically what when we say that my dragon common room has the Christians are often worried about that because like dragons they're bad. St. Michael fights one and I'm like dragons praise God in the Psalms. So what is a dragon? It's a big snake. Wait, it's a monster. Wait, it's a so the claim about the reality of unicorns or dragons. One, they're in the scriptures, but two, Draco means snake. So yeah, they're giant snakes. I mean, there's pictures of some of the ones that come out of the Indian jungle. So did we see a dragon or did we say Draco? And then we're layering on different interpretations of that word. So unicorn is rhinoceros. It's a monoceros. They exist, right? So you could say maybe you don't understand the description, like with William and his little dogs in the rock. I mean, it's clear some dogs crawled in a rock and some in the quarry, they broke them open and look, there's some dogs in a rock. And you can say they really found some dogs in a rock. And that's kind of startling. How did the dogs get there? The children that turned green probably were eating too much, green vegetables and they were suffering from malnutrition. The man that goes under the mound and finds a goblet, he could have found a grave. There are plenty. I mean, there's like the Sutton Hoo grave that had the great jewelry and so forth. There are ways you can say, we misunderstood the description. So that's one option.
Oh, so I totally agree there. I would say that
Okay.
there's a difference between, um, if someone posits a new ontology, like fairies actually exist, versus
Right.
saying that their explanation of fairies is actually some known natural phenomenon that already has evidence that they just misconstrued. Those two things are different levels of claim. So if you're going to take it at face value that fairies actually exist, that level of claim would be unreasonable to accept. Now, if you're going to say they had these experiences but misinterpreted them as fairies and really it was just these unknown phenomenon, I think that's reasonable. That's perfectly reasonable to do.
Okay. Okay.
But the first stage I would say is taking it at the face value. Is this new ontology actually an existing thing? Nope. That part I don't think can be justified by historical testimony. That part I think is outside of the bounds of what history can do. You can do the
Well,
second part.
all
You
the
can
thing
do
is,
the
all historical testimony can do is relate. I mean, it's in language, it's written, it's you can say the problem of reliable versus unreliable narrator constantly, right? It's literature. History is a form of storytelling and literature. And so your primary frame has to be, do we believe each other as reliable narrators? One, do we trust in this medium as a conveyor of truth? either, speech, language, written things, the written thing is written at the time that we claim that it's pointing to. When you get to the Old Testament stories, which I do hope we can get to, you realize playing with those as historical documents, you have to go through layers and layers of argument, as we're doing with William Newborough. And William Newborough is one source written in a period that we know, the late 12th century, with other conversations that we can have with it. The problem with the Old Testament is it's kind of its own witness for the most part, although there is archaeology and for example, some carvings and things like that. We have a prism at the University of Chicago in the Oriental Institute that names a king that's in the story, right? So you can say, fine, we have external reference for that own source, but to the degree that you have a text that refers only to itself, you're in a problem already, right? If Abraham exists, if we have external references to someone who is named Abraham, I'm not sure we do with Abraham. We definitely do with David, right? King David. At what point do we say Moses existed or not? Oh, possibly when we find, an external archaeological reference that mentions him.
Right, but I think that'd be the
Right.
secondary concern. I still think the first thing is this new ontology thing I'm talking about, saying fairies exist. If the claim in
Okay.
the story is that there is this extra magic, miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, the belief that that is an accurate statement that corresponds to reality, I don't think it can be justified by history. So I think all of those things are just, no matter what historical documents you find, those can't be justified. In order to justify those, you need some kind of modern empirical data that such a thing is possible before it's rational to believe that, regardless of the trustworthiness of the source. So the trustworthiness of the source is just a secondary concern that we would go into. Like, if it says Caesar crossed the Rubicon, then we know, well, okay, what sources do we have? Is there any archaeological data? We'd ask those kinds of questions.
Right, but
But
we
if he
can't have
said,
archaeological data. We don't have any archaeological data on Caesar crossing the
oh,
Rubicon.
right. But
And
that's what I'm saying, is that that's
and
a second
apparently,
question.
there's only, for Caesar's own account of what he did in the Gallic Wars, there's like only late manuscripts. There's manuscripts from, I don't know, the 10th century, let's say. Most of the classical manuscripts only come from the 9th, 10th, 11th century AD. So somebody in 9th century, 10th century Francia could have written it all and pretended to be writing Caesar's account.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with you. But I'd say
Okay.
that that claim is still more rational to believe than Caesar crossed the Rubicon on a magical flying unicorn. Then I'd say that one's like, we don't even need to look at the archaeological data. We can just say, nope, didn't happen. And so, but for the second claim, we should start looking for the archaeological data. We should start cross-referencing other sources.
Right.
The things that actually have a basis in physical reality are more reasonable to believe than miracles, magical, mythical creatures, et cetera, et cetera. So those kinds of claims are the first layer of what I would consider the historical methodology. We can eliminate uh, magical claims. Those claims just can't be supported by history. Just
But
looking
you
at the
do believe, no,
documents.
but sorry, so now I'm confused. You do believe in miracles, but you don't believe in magic.
I believe both are possible. I don't think either actually exist. So I think both can happen or could happen. I don't think there's any evidence for either one.
What would count for you as evidence? So
Novel.
the thing is, what I think we've happily established, right, is you recognize that historical sources are testimony. They're
Mhm.
witnesses of other people saying something. And
Yep.
we obviously, both within history, and it ought to be also within Christianity, because we care as Christians that the testimonies are true. And so the entire edifice of historical criticism that most people use to bash Christianity with developed because Christians actually care about the truth of the historical claim. Okay, so, and this is a problem because you're always, it's like the Gospels make claims of, I this is witness and I am witnessing to the truth and many people saw it and so forth like that. But you're right. As readers now, what we're sifting through is other people's reports, other people's accounts of what they think they saw, other people's accounts of what they think they experienced. So we are always in our own, in our own experience with reality, but it's dependent on other people's accounts of things they experienced or our own experience. So what you're saying, what I think, let me make sure I understand your claim, your statement is, I have never experienced these things, therefore I can't accept that they've happened.
No, I would say that you would
Okay.
need some kind of like novel testable predictions that there is such a force. So I think that the reasonable basis of evidence for a new thing existing is novel testable predictions. So if you want to say WIMPs, weakly interactive massive particles, exist, I think they exist. We're going to do this experiment. I predict that if we do this experiment, we'll find this result in this reactor, and anybody can test it in the world, confirm the results. You do the test, get the results. Other people do the test, gets the results. Okay, that's evidence that WIMPs exist.
Um, it's sorry, WIMPs.
Weakly interactive massive particles is a thing in physics.
Oh, okay. So now we're at particle physics. Okay.
Yeah, so I was thinking, just I gave that an example of as a new
But
thing they could posit.
they could posit the existence of the, I mean, but that, I mean, those frames of proof actually depend on a lot of theorizing, and I'm the wrong person to talk to about whether or not we can talk particle physics. However, one of my friends, who writes as Ethers Are, who is a wideband antenna um, uh, engineer and physicist, he's been working on a discussion of the problem of wave and particle understanding of the
Duality.
electromagnetic spectrum. Yes, and that question, and saying, even our descriptions of what's going on at that level depend on our framing and theorizing of what it is that those properties are. So I'd have to punt on that particular kind of proof, but to say within science as such, we are also depending on frames of explanation that themselves have a priori assumptions that can't necessarily be proven.
Oh, sure, I would agree, but that part
Okay.
I wasn't specifically focusing on the physics here. I was just giving an
Okay. Okay.
example of a
All
novel
right. Because I
testable
can't I
prediction.
can't do that kind of
Right.
thing. But what I do know is science itself is a framed problem for the things that it can prove, that that can be proved within it. And we could go down that path of different kinds of things that have been absolutely, quote, accepted as true, but then subsequent reframing of the evidence has suggested a different proof. Which, I mean, like, the famous one is always Galileo, right? It's like you have the he's not got it because he's their science or anti-science. They've got it because they've got the same phenomenon that they're trying to argue proves what, right? So Galileo has these telescopes that he's looking at objects through. I mean, the first question is he actually seeing anything, right? Are the things that he's seeing, those extra moons of Jupiter, in fact there in reality, or is it an artifact of his lens?
Imagination.
Or
Or
the
yeah,
imagine
like a smudge on the lens, yeah.
a smudge on the lens, or a production of the optics or something like that. And then once you see those things, well, it's like, okay, no, I trust this lens that I'm looking through. I mean, that makes all sorts of claims about, can we trust our senses? Can we trust the extension of our senses in those instruments? Then you're still at the stage of, can I trust that my explanation of what this movement is actually accurate? And when Galileo, the famous proof that he makes of why he's right and they're wrong is, in fact, in a letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. Are you familiar with this
Mm-mm.
text? So he's getting in trouble, but he wants his position at court in Florence, and he likes being patronized by the Medici, and she's the Grand Duchess of the Duke, the mother, the Grand Duchess Christina Medici, and she's been having arguments with the Dominicans in her social circle about how Galileo is misinterpreting the scriptures, because we very well know that Joshua made the sun stand still. God made the sun stand still for Joshua so that he could finish, bringing down the walls of Jericho. And Galileo says, well, what Augustine said was, the interpretation of the scripture should not be fixed to a particular physical explanation, because that physical explanation could change depending on our understanding of the events. And it's actually easier to explain that Joshua made the sun stand still by saying that God stopped it revolving in the center, as opposed to it stopped it moving across the arc of the it's not flat Earth. It's geocentric versus solar, heliocentric.
Yeah.
And Galileo is trying to say the heliocentric argument actually makes better sense of what is described in the scriptures than the geocentric one does. So different physical explanations, same scripture, but like the rhinoceros and the unicorn, don't tie your reading of scripture to these physical explanations, because scripture is going to be right, but maybe we're wrong in our understanding of what it's describing.
Right. So I would say that to count as evidence, you need to justify the belief of some new kind of thing. You would need to make a novel testable prediction, which would mean a prediction about something we don't know yet in the future that you can then discover in the future and be right. And if you're right first, even if more data can come along and correct you with a better model, that doesn't matter. Even if there are other interpretations that can reinterpret the data, that doesn't matter. As long as you're able to predict the future about some thing that you don't know yet, and you get it right first more than anybody else, that is evidence. It may not be great evidence, but it is evidence for your position. So like in this, I used WIMPs as an example, but I can just use archaeology, Tiktaalik. People predicted that if evolution is true, we're going to find a transitional fossil between a fish and a lizard at this exact strata in this exact location. They looked and they found it. Like, there you go. That's evidence. Even if it's not other ways to interpret it, other ways that may reinvent the wheel or rediscover a new model later, this is still at least evidence. And so I need something parallel to that in the context of unicorns or miracles or magic in order to make those believable. And once they're believable in reality, today we can then infer that they actually occurred in historical accounts.
So I'd say that, I mean, philosophically, then your position has to be agnosticism indefinitely, because these things take time to be proven. I mean, maybe your proof of angels will come in to 2300. And I mean, it hasn't happened yet. And so we just don't have proof yet.
Right. So if there was no other evidence, then you would have to take the position of agnosticism. But we do have an abundance of another kind of evidence, which is illusion, delusion, misconception, fallacies, biases that show that these kinds of things do happen today, where people see angels, people see leprechauns, people see demons and talk to people who are dead and deceased. But we know that these are psychological conditions. We have this. So because we've discovered bereavement delusion, for example. Bereavement delusion is something that 30 to 60% of people experience, where they see, hear, touch, interact with dead loved ones. We know that this is a psychological condition. They're not actually speaking to dead loved ones. We've tested this in the lab. This is very well established. And so if we see an account in history of someone seeing a dead loved one, if we're comparing the possible explanations, the loved one actually came back from the dead or bereavement delusion, before we have evidence of one way or the other, we would be agnostic. But because we now have evidence of bereavement delusions as being a real thing, that explanation is going to be better, because it has an abundance of evidence that we know exists in reality, whereas the other one does not. So like if we saw a hoof print in the snow and you want to say a horse did it, that's always going to be better than a unicorn, because we have lots of evidence of horses. So the same thing would apply to history. If we have evidence of a particular illusion, delusion, misconception that can explain the data, that's going to be a better explanation than to say that the miracles or angels actually exist, because we don't have any evidence of those yet.
We're talking pretty magically right now.
What do you mean?
Well, so the interesting thing about angels is they're considered messengers, right? And so let's go to the Old Testament. You mentioned Abraham and Moses. It's like the most amazing things that are described are the temple visions that Isaiah and Ezekiel give us, right? So the Isaiah says, "I saw in the temple the seraphim singing holy, holy, holy around the throne." And Ezekiel says he saw the cherubim carrying the chariot with the flashing wheels with eyes and things like that, right? So these visions of realities outside of the earthly, that they say they're in heaven, right? That these are visions of things happening in heaven, and that is actually the claim within Christianity, which is a continuation of these temple mysteries, that Jesus is the one who came from heaven, entered into our reality, and then carried our sacrifice back through the veil into the temple and the Holy of Holies, and that this is so it's an interplanar experience, right? And you say the evidence for that kind of interaction, angels speaking from a distance, without any physical support for it, is nothing, except for we're doing it right now through the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So I'd still say there we may be misunderstanding the descriptions of things that we are now practicing in reality. I mean, electricity and the electromagnetic spectrum and the the digital silica that what we're happening through is this kind of magical transformation of gemstones and precious metals and stuff that are transformed into computer motherboards that then carry our thoughts somehow through these electromagnetic impulses that then our brains are able to take in and somehow reinterpret as thoughts. I mean, this is all pretty magical, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh yeah, so I would consider it more rational to believe that the visions of these guys had of the angels were an electrical communication through a TV from super advanced aliens than to believe it was from a supernatural being of some kind, because we have more evidence of technological TVs than we do of aliens. And so to say that the TV explanation would be a better explanation of this phenomenon than the angels, I would agree. But I think we still have one that's far better than that, which is delusion. You have tons and tons of people who see and speak to angels every day all across the world, which is very well explained by delusion. And so that explanation, because it has even more evidence than TVs doing this, and it is something that we know is a phenomenon that happens through all human brains, and there were equally as developed human brains back then as there are today, would be a better explanation than TVs, because we don't know of any TVs that could exist back then. So I would agree that that's better than supernatural angels, but there's an even better explanation that has an even more abundance of evidence that we know is caused by a thing that we know existed at that time frame. That one seems to be an even better explanation than the TVs.
Your chat's disagreeing with me.
Don't read the chat.
Hi, chat.
As someone who is familiar with how the internet works, never read the chat.
Yes, never read the chat. It's filled with demons. No, so the thing is, you and I are not that far apart in the problem. I'm enjoying this and appreciating your thinking through it. Realizing I said I was a storyteller, right? You asked me to put my fedora hat on, and I say I'm trying to do storytelling, and recognizing that our knowledge, it's so much human knowledge, is actually framed by narrative. Right? We go back to my little post about fake news and stuff like that, and everybody back in 2016 was quite alarmed at the thought that we wouldn't know who to trust. And for me, it was interesting that it was happening on the internet. It was happening in this digital social media. It was happening in this multiplicity of voices and opinions and perspectives and claims. And everyone was worrying about what was true, what was real, what could we trust? How can we, if we can't trust the New York Times, nothing's true anymore. I, as a historian, which you asked me on is, hopefully as a historian and not as a scientist, although I think science is also a narrative. That one of the things I've had to practice professionally and to help people understand how to deal with is the degree to which our own narratives keep changing in our historical narratives, in our sort of explanations, and the rhetorical and epistemological problem of when we reframe them rhetorically, people are more or less persuaded depending on the previous narratives that they had. So one of your chat members is saying, I'm a scientist and what she's saying about electricity is bullshit. Okay. I've described to you one way of thinking about the transmission of electricity. Now, if you want to argue wave and particle theory with my friend Hans, go for it, because that's a different kind of framing problem. But the questions that we're talking about here, all of this is happening in language. What kind of proof are you going to get from me except for a story, right? It's going to have to happen in a this verbal narrative form, which has its own structures of conviction or not.
Sure. So, but would you agree that with my description of the levels of evidence that essentially there was an advanced television that was conveying these informations to the people who saw the visions would be better than angels, but delusion, which we have evidence of today, which is caused by parts of the brain, and we have pretty good evidence that their human brains were pretty much the same as our human brains, that would be even better than the electrical television conveying these informations. Would you agree with that hierarchy of hypotheses in reasonability?
No, but it's partly saying, so I don't trust other people's reports. is the psychology question that you're saying. It's like these are delusions because they've had them and I haven't.
Well, I'd say that we have tons of scientific data that there are delusions that produce essentially synonymous accounts from people. And the brains, based on our evidence of evolution, haven't really changed much in the past 2,000 to 3,000 years. And so if these brains today have this problem and those brains are about the same, they also have the same problem. We have
Oh,
lots of evidence of this.
well, okay, so layers there, right? One, yes, I do believe that their brains were like ours. Two, then you have a problem with evolution. Because that means that evolution doesn't work. Hi, chat. Because it means that we've never seen an actual species change in observable time of humanity. And if you want to argue that question, you got to talk to my friend Vox. And he has the mathematical problem with the theory of evolution by natural selection, that we don't have enough generations to deal with. So yes, I do agree that their brains were like ours. I think that the sort of psychology claim, and I actually I have moderate, like mild level academic level training of psychology, because I did graduate level courses in it some years ago as a prep for a project that I was working on prayer. And I recognize psychology itself as a field is bound by its own historicity. It's an invention of the late 19th century. And so the framing of their claims about reality and normativity and things, the back in the past, yes, your chat's worrying about whether Jesus's resurrection was, provable by it. We do believe that happened once. We recognize, and so are there unique events that could never be repeated and that we're not going to see otherwise, right? Psychology depends on a claim of normality. So you're saying all of these people are like me, but these occasional oddities are proof that didn't happen. It's saying that there can never be excellence or the opposite end, absolute. There's no bell curve, is what you're saying. The only the middle of the bell curve actually is truth.
I'd say rational. So I'd say it'd only be rational to believe that the middle of the bell curve would be what we should accept as the cause of this phenomenon until
Okay.
the amount of the edges of the bell curve go up. So if it's like 99.99999 something percent of this phenomenon is caused by X, and 0.000000 something 1% is caused by Y, and we see X, the rational conclusion is it was caused by the thing that did it 99% of the time. That's always going to be the rational conclusion.
Okay, I no. The thing is, if that's your frame, then I invite you to test it. I'll say two things that I think about that. One, all of that happens. All of our statistical studying and our normalizing and deciding which one's in the proper place of the bell curve happens within the same existence. Right? So if my claim, this is all a creature, is true, then all of your evidence still happens within that reality. And so it's like fish in water. Can you test the water? Can you actually understand the water that you're in? Saying the claim of revelation is that we've had ruptures from, even heaven is part of creation too, because God created heaven and the earth. That the problem being that
Yeah,
can you
just to clarify,
actually
I'm not quite understanding, because I think everything that exists in the same reality. So I don't quite
right.
follow.
So can you disprove that it's a creature?
No, you
And
can't prove a negative.
exactly. So that one's a problem. You're saying that the bell curve
Wait,
makes
why
no
is that a
sense,
problem?
because you're still trying to it's like you're bootstrapping yourself. Your rationality is trying to bootstrap itself with it, but it itself is a creature.
I'm not sure I follow. So like, because we can't prove a negative, there's infinitely many hypotheses that can explain all data, any data point. Like we could have all
No,
been
no, that's not what I meant. That we cannot prove or disprove the reality of our creation because we're in it.
reality. I think you still could. Like, for example, you could say, if God exists and created the world, when I die, I'll see him in heaven. If you die and then see him in heaven, that's great evidence that that description of the world is correct. So you can make predictions based on a model of the way reality is, and if those predictions come true, you have a reason to believe that description of reality, the entirety of reality, is correct. So I wouldn't say, I mean, you
Then,
can't
then
prove
you're
it with
with
100%
Pascal's
certainty.
wager, which I understand has certain philosophical hiccups in it too. But might as well believe because it's the better bet.
Well, my view of Pascal's wager is that the probability of going to heaven under atheism with no God is exactly the same as the probability of going to heaven with a God. So I would say that Pascal's wager mathematically doesn't show any difference one way or the other, but it's a
Okay,
slightly
that's
different
fair.
topic.
And I'll say, living with the experience of I praise God for my existence and give thanks for it makes me happy, right? So you could say that there's a psychology there that to say that it gives us more joy to be in wonder at our existence. Okay, but let's leave it.
So I agree with that one. If something makes you happy, then
Okay.
that's a reason to do it, even if it's regardless of truth. I think happiness is more important than truth, so go for happiness. But I'm still
Okay,
not
so we're with
understanding.
Aristotle and contemplation, right? We want to the contemplative life is the highest, and we aim for our contemplation or happiness. Okay, so we're within a frame that says we the fish can prove or disprove the existence of water.
Yeah.
I don't think the fish can do that. And then the second claim you're making is the normal on the bell curve is more rational than the ends.
Yes, by statistics.
So genius doesn't exist.
It does, but if it does, then there's usually a difference in data. So we have more data. Like if I say that Ramanujan, the mathematician, was able to solve all of these incredibly big math problems or whatever.
Mm.
Now I could interpret that as just a lie. Like it's all made up. Now it would be more plausible that it was made up than an actual genius existed. But then if we look at the mathematical proofs and say, okay, well, it's right and we can check it. Well, now we have an extra data point. There's a story of a guy solving this problem, and here's the solution.
Can we
Now,
understand the solution? How many of us can understand that solution?
well, pretty easy. Well, I mean, I don't know. The people who've studied math at a calculus or plus level,
Have
something.
you?
Yes.
What level of math are you? What level of mathematician am I talking to here?
I've studied moderate levels of quantum mechanics.
Okay. Algebraic geometry,
Yes,
topology,
that stuff is like high school.
vector
Pre
calculus. Vector calculus I know is baby math. Okay, so you're at PhD level or higher?
in some fields, not in all. I've ignored statistics completely. I don't know. I know
Okay, good.
nothing.
Statistics is gambling.
Yeah, right. It's all lies. They're all liars.
Statistics, I get. Yeah, we're there. We're. So, what's your favorite mathematics? You say quantum mechanics, but help me out here because now the highest I got was vector calc. So you got to tell me stories about that world of contemplation that you live in.
Stories about well,
You have to tell me stories because I'm a narrative person. I only know stories.
So I like
And you guys
talking.
write in number, and number is a different thing from words.
1+1 is great, best math ever. But I talk about infinities and quantum mechanics because I find it interesting in the way that it relates to the God debate. So I talk about
Okay.
derivative equations and infinities and adding infinities and subtracting infinities and how you can have past infinities, those kinds of things.
Okay. Yeah. So I again, I have to like outsource my knowledge to some other people that know math way better than I do. Okay. So not very many people understand the highest level equations.
Sure.
Okay. So if we're going for normality as truth and understanding and rationality, then that blots out the knowledge of those high level equations because most people can't follow those discussions.
I don't think so. So like, I don't understand how an engine works, but I can see I can drive my car and it works really well. And so even though I don't understand all of the mechanics of how it works, there is a demonstrable prediction that is derived from these things. If I say, here is some complicated field I don't understand, if this complicated field works, gigantic pieces of metal will be able to fly in the sky. Let me see, plane works. And so I have a reason to believe all of the fields associated with the plane in the sky. So that's aerodynamics, all the different mechanical fields that are involved in engines and fuel and wiring and electricity and
Okay.
all of those things. All of those, I understand none of them, but I'm justified in believing all of them because there's a plane there and I can see it flying, and the engineers show me that thing is a part of the plane. So even though I don't need to understand all of the different parts of the theory to be justified, all I need to do is say, if this theory makes predictions and we can confirm those predictions with some kind of experiment, like build a plane and see if it flies, that makes it reasonable for me to believe, even though I don't understand all of the intricacies of the field.
All right, I give you the proposition then, and we were actually running up on my edge of being able to carry on, so we'll have to be continued eventually. I have two thoughts that I want to say about, one, the end of that bell curve, and two, what you just said. I would say, I need you to be able to think about this, that the saints are in fact proof of the psychology that you're describing, in that people who are able to align themselves with God's will and live without sin are blessed. And you can see it when you meet people that live better than not. That sin is real, and the way, and that what we're talking about with, I mean, this is where Galileo and Augustine were both warning. Don't worry about Augustine was very important, very adamant on this. Don't worry about the physical descriptions of things in interpreting the scriptures. The scriptures are not about that. They're not about describing airplanes. Sure, fine, airplanes, great. They're about the effects on your soul. And that is the kind of knowledge we need for salvation, not worrying about, geophysical events that we can learn about by observation.
So I would agree. I would count that as a novel testable prediction. So if adopting a particular ideology would make you a better person, and we could test this and then have X number of people adopt this ideology, and it makes them disproportionately happier than other ideologies, that would count as evidence in some sense. So I would count that as evidence.
Okay, that's
But
fair.
the studies have been done, and mostly it's
Oh, mostly
subjective and cultural.
you mostly find people are sinners. Yeah, I get that too. So the
Well, no, actually, the opposite. I would find that there's actually multiple ideologies that improve people's lives independent of the ideology. It's more about how the ideology relates to the person in the community, in such that it makes the person more cohesive in the community, which then gives them social benefits. And so it's not about the ideology that makes a person a better life. It's about how their community accepts that person for the ideology they have. And so it's
aha,
going the
but
other way.
there you're now not actually talking about Christianity, because Christians recognize that people are going to hate us because we say things that make them uncomfortable. Like, don't do that. Okay, so but let me go back to the bell curve one, because I'm running out of time and I want to make this point. So the high end of the bell curve, the geniuses, the people that understand things that not everybody else can appreciate or even comprehend, right? People at the middle of the IQ bell curve don't get what you're talking about with quantum mechanics. Okay, so Tesla, for example, what was he doing experiments that actually found real events and
Yes.
properties, and he said he learned them from angels.
Yes, Ramanujan said he got his mathematics from the Hindu god, so that's why I brought him up, actually.
So this seems to me an intriguing suggestion that maybe there are some things that can communicate with us. They're literally messengers, right? Communication. I like that we brought this back around to communication, media, right? Angels are media. They're messengers of something. And being at the very high level of contemplation seems to put some people in communication with them.
Right. So I would consider that probably the closest or the best evidence for theism is examples like Ramanujan and Tesla and the Vedas. The Vedas says the age of the earth is 4.3 billion years, which is really close. That's the best evidence I've seen for a God ever. But it seems more likely that those happen by random chance and through psychological factors that we have lots of evidence of that can cause these sensations, in addition to something like autism, which we know can solve similar problems or greater problems than Tesla did without the need of a communication of an angel. And so because the same kinds of mathematical genius can be achieved without any communication with angels, and there's this psychological phenomenon that gives us the sensation that we're talking to angels, the fact that those two things can be combined and they have significantly more evidence than angels do gives us a, like, kind of like my delusion example is better than angels for the same reason in the historical evidence hierarchy.
We're just going to have to say, yes, we disagree. Feckinal, hi there, I'm nuts. Yes, because when you're speaking with the knowledge of spiritual realities, the world thinks you're crazy. And so, and again, I mean, it's interesting. It's like over and over and over again, we end up with these situations where someone like Ramanujan or someone like Tesla, they will sound nuts to the rest of us. What do they have in contact with? You can say, all right, it's into the bell curve, within our own explanatory framework, or it seems to me that you are interested yourself in pushing the edges of that explanatory framework, which is why you keep having these conversations. So we carry on. I mean, we're sort of in contemplation and study. That seems to me a happy place to be.
Absolutely. We are getting to your point. You said you need to go right about now. Do you want to give
Yeah.
any links or references where people can find more about your work?
So if you went with my fedora hat on with my poetry work, look for dragoncommonroom.com. For my professional scholarly person, my homepage, but you can go to dragoncommonroom.com and everything is linked there. And the live stream that I do, the Mosaic Arc, we were talking about magic this week. So maybe some of your audience will be curious.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Tom.
Talk to you later.